Does anyone remember those giant indoor playgrounds from back in the day? You'd beg your parents to be taken to these magical places of vast ball pits, convoluting tunnels, and slides that seemed to go on for miles. Together with friends, you'd pretend to be brave explorers, embarking on quests through the maze of vibrantly colored plastic. Or you'd play hide and seek, as you excitedly hurtle yourself through the jungle gyms, balanced over tightropes, zipped around on track lines, and barreled headfirst down tunnel slides. The place from my childhood was called Adventureland. Just writing its name sends a wave of nostalgia through me, followed closely by a chill. It was located in a shopping plaza 20 minutes from my house. From the outside, it looked run down, save for the colorful block letters that adorned its entrance. Once inside, a kid could get lost in its awing environment for hours, days maybe, if their parents let them. I'll never forget those tunnel slides. Those few seconds of darkness never failed to thrill me, where it didn't matter if your eyes were opened or closed. It all looked the same to every kid. A mutual blackness seen by none, yet experienced by all who dared plunge into its abyssal mouth. I had a love-hate relationship with one particular slide. I remember standing at the top of it with bated breath. The slide would go down 4 stories, which was taller than my house, and dump its contents at the ground level of the playscape. 4 stories of darkness. A red plastic tube that had no lights, no windows, nothing to grip as you helplessly slid down it. Sometimes I'd linger at the top, a certain fear rooting me in place. I'd let kids go in front of me and listen to their whoops fade, like the sirens on a receding ambulance. Then I'd anxiously look at the other end of the slide, a part of me wondering what would happen if the kid somehow got lost in the tunnel, never to be seen again. Before these thoughts could manifest into reality, I'd catch the kid emerging unscathed with a wide grin on his face. "It's safe," a voice inside my head said. A voice that would become more clear as I grew older. The voice of reason. "See? Nothing to be afraid of." But sometimes, that voice is wrong. Sometimes a kid's gut feeling isn't just his imagination getting the best of him. When every hair on your body feels like needles on a pine tree, you just know that something doesn't feel right. Grown-ups won't believe you. Why would they? You're just a kid. Your input is irrelevant. That's why the grown-ups, including my parents, never believed me when I told them that my sister had been kidnapped by the man who lived in the tunnels of Adventureland. After all, I was just a kid whose sister had gone missing. There were always those dumb rumors that spread through town during a time before text messaging and social media. Stories were swapped on concrete stoops like Pokemon cards, or outside convenience stores, where $5 was enough to buy a day's worth of candy. They spoke of some sicko wedging razor blades in the cracks of tunnel slides. An unsuspecting kid would go down the slide and come out with a gash the size of the Mississippi River down their back. I had always wondered how someone could possibly put a razor blade there, with the slides being so slippery and all. Other rumors included people hiding in the ball pits. If a lone child got too close, they'd grab them, drug them up, and take them through some secret trapdoor at the bottom of the pit. "How many kids have they taken?" I'd ask with fearful eyes. "Oh, hundreds," my friends would reply nonchalantly, and go back to trading their cards. I always took these rumors with a grain of salt. Were they true? Probably not. Could they be true? Possibly. It was enough for me to play at Adventureland with caution. I would take extra time crawling through the tunnels, aware that someone could be hiding around the corner. waiting to grab me. Emily, my younger sister, was not as careful as I was. She was naive and vulnerable. I had introduced Emily to the wonders of Adventureland. I proudly showed her how to use the track lines and tipped her off on the arcade games that gave out the most tickets. I also led her through the tunnels and down the tunnel slides, including the one that was 4 stories tall. I couldn't show her any fear, so without hesitation, I plummeted down the slide. I heard her giggles until about halfway down. Then I heard nothing for a few seconds. Everything went dark. I was alone. I thought of hidden razor blades. Before I could panic, I emerged into the safety of the light. I sighed in relief and looked up at the smiling face of my sister. I waved cheerfully. See? Nothing to be afraid of. At the time, I couldn't bear to scare her with rumors that weren't proven to be true. I couldn't tell her to watch out for razor blades in the slides, or kidnappers in the ball pit, or used needles in the tunnels. If you saw the way she looked up to me, like I was her hero, you'd understand. The night before her disappearance, I had a terrible dream. I was at Adventureland, standing before the giant playscape. The arcade behind me was silent. I was alone. There was a gripping pressure on my chest. The same inexplicable fear I felt those few moments inside the red tunnel slide resurfaced. Only this time, it was prolonged and torturous. My eyes wandered up towards one of the tunnels. There, in one of the fishbowl windows, was a man. His ugly face was twisted in a sneer as he looked down at me with morbid pleasure. With a long, crooked finger, he beckoned me over. My body began to move towards him, climbing up and up and up, until I woke up. My bed was soaked with sweat. I saw the man's gleeful face every time I closed my eyes, only now it was more contorted. I shuddered and tried to find sleep. I knew the bad news was coming seconds before the phone rang. My mother answered it and began screaming. Together, we drove to Adventureland to find my sister. The police were already there. They kept a close watch on the people who came and went. I overheard several grown-ups talking that day, and this is what I was able to piece together. Emily was at a birthday party for one of her classmates. When it was time to go into one of the side rooms for pizza and cake, my dad, one of the chaperones, did a quick head count. He noticed that my sister was missing. After waiting impatiently for some time, he started calling her name through the slides. She did not come out. Several kids went in to go find her, and when they turned up empty-handed, stuff started getting crazy. My dad started freaking out on one of the supervisors and demanded a search party for Emily. The police were called. They too couldn't find anything. The grown-ups started telling stories about an abduction, where a kid was taken to the bathroom. Their head was shaved, and they were snuck out of the grocery store under this quick disguise. The same thing must have happened to Emily, they said. I must have swept through the playscape a dozen times looking for Emily. I knew it was pointless. She had been taken by the man I saw in my dreams. The man who lived in the tunnels. I just knew it. My gut told me so. But who would believe me? Adventureland closed its doors for good a few days later. When the cops asked for surveillance footage of the property, the owner shamefully admitted that there were no cameras installed. When the building was inspected more closely, it turned out that Adventureland had several glaring safety violations. Emily's tomb of plastic had been sealed the next day. I knew she was still in there somewhere. Whether or not she was still alive was a different question. My parents were too preoccupied with Emily's disappearance to notice I had taken a long bike ride. My mission was to find my sister and bring her back. The outside of Adventureland looked more dilapidated than usual. I went around the back, looking for a way in. There was a door with a small window above the handle. I picked up a rock and broke the glass. Luckily, the security alarm didn't go off. Another violation. So I let myself in. I crept through the building until I came to the main room. The playground looked like the skeleton of some massive exotic beast. The only source of light came from the front side windows, giving the room an eerie amber glow. I approached one of the tunnels of the beast and stood there timidly. It was pitch black in there. I dug through my backpack and fished out the flashlight I had brought with me. I snapped it on and cast a beam of light around the playscape. My flashlight bounced from one fishbowl window to the next, looking for that sneering face from my nightmare. When they all seemed clear, I shone my light into the tunnel. Then, I reached into my pocket, and my hands gripped around the cold handle of my pocket knife. I started having second thoughts. What if the man was still here, waiting for me? Sure, I had a knife, but it wouldn't be enough to take on a full-grown man. Maybe if I hit him in the jugular. I didn't know exactly where the jugular was, but my friends swore up and down that if you got hit in the jugular, you were as good as dead. What if I missed? It would only take him 3 seconds to overpower me. What if this guy wasn't even human? As if to answer my question, a chuckle came from deep within the darkness. My heart leapt into my throat. I waited for a minute, listening intently for footsteps, or in this case, someone shuffling through the tunnels. The place was as quiet as an empty cathedral. I thought of Emily, her radiating innocent smile, the way she looked at me. I felt an invigorating surge of bravery wash over me. I climbed into the tunnel, flashlight in one hand and pocket knife in the other. I crawled through the tunnels cautiously. I had spent enough time in here to know where I was going, but that didn't change the fact at how terrifying the darkness was. With each turn, my bravery faded more and more. A new feeling was taking its place. I was going to die in here. After crawling through the maze of tunnels for some time, hearing nothing but my short, rapid breaths and thundering heart rate, I came upon a strange sight. Someone had burnt a hole in the plastic surface of the tunnel, but it didn't stop there. The hole kept going on a weird angle through the adjacent wall and into the building's cavity. It looked like straight out of one of those Prison Break movies that played on TV. He took Emily into there, I thought with a dull sense of rage. I climbed through the small hole and ventured beyond the wall. I passed by pink tufts of wall insulation that resembled cotton candy. The plumbing pipes hummed silently overhead as I crawled on all fours. The air here was heavy and had a wet basement smell to it. The hole finally opened up into a small concrete room. There was a dirty mattress in one corner with scattered articles of clothing on top of it. Several yellowed newspapers and envelopes were strewn all over the floor, along with a few cans of beer and baked beans. I picked up a random envelope. It was simply addressed to a person named Mr. Robert Gray. That was it. No address, no sender information. A sickening thought entered my head. Someone had been living in here. Was his name Robert Gray? With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and withdrew the enclosed paper. There was a message written on it. See? Nothing to be afraid of. After reading this, I decided it was time to leave. During my frantic escape, I thought I heard something chasing me. Something evil. I turned my head once I was back in the tunnels, and I could have sworn I saw two orange eyes floating towards me. They appeared to be gaining on me. There was no time to think. I scrambled through the twisting tubes of plastic, my flashlight bobbing ahead of me. I didn't dare cast the light behind me. Whatever was chasing me, it was definitely not human. I had only one option if I was going to survive. That option was coming up fast. The 4-story tunnel slide. Without any hesitation, I dove headfirst down it. I closed my eyes, waiting to get cut to ribbons by dozens of razor blades. But before I knew it, I plopped down onto solid ground. I sprang to my feet and booked it for the back exit. My pursuer wasn't behind me anymore. But I sure as hell wasn't taking any chances. I didn't slow down until I was on my bike and a half mile away from Adventureland. I kept looking over my shoulder the rest of the way home for those orange eyes. But I made it home safely. My parents didn't even notice I was gone, or that they had almost lost another child that day. I kept my encounter at Adventureland to myself for all these years. Nobody at the time would have believed me anyways. I was just a stupid kid, with an imagination that had been tainted by the abduction of my sister. Even as I grew older, I'd just be seen as a damaged kid with a traumatizing past. My word accounted for nothing. I began keeping tabs on that old building Adventureland used to be in. It became a hibachi restaurant after that. They held a large fundraiser there, and the chef put cyanide in one of the dishes, poisoning a dozen people. 8 people died that night. Then it became a house of worship. Some faulty wiring caused a fire to break out during one of the services. 14 people died. Today, it stands as a daycare center for children. And so far, no incidents have occurred. Yet.
When people find out that my wife is Russian, they imagine a tall blonde girl with a funny accent who wears heels for every grocery run. Reality couldn't be farther from the stereotype. Lana is dark-haired, speaks better English than I do, and is completely obsessed with sneakers. She does meet one stereotype, though. She never gets cold, seeing how she lived in Russia up until she was 18. Not in Moscow, of course. Did you know that Moscow's actually pretty warm? There are entire states in America where winters are far colder than anything Muscovites ever have to deal with. No, my wife comes from a tiny town far up in the Russian north, in the tundra. A dark, gloomy, and very cold place inside the Arctic Circle, with extremely harsh winters and even harsher people. A place that truly meets the stereotypes. I've met my in-laws all of 2 times, including our wedding. Both times they traveled to the United States. Frankly, I never had any intention of visiting Lana's hometown. Until she got that fateful call 9 days ago. My mother-in-law had suffered a stroke. While her condition was stable for the time being, the local doctor expected the worst could happen at any minute. Transporting her to a better hospital was out of the question, as she was in no state for that kind of a journey. My wife made travel arrangements immediately. I had a valid Russian visa from a business trip to Moscow a few weeks prior, so I decided to go with her. Now, getting to my wife's hometown isn't easy. You're in for a long flight to Moscow, then a connecting flight to Norilsk, one of the largest cities in the Russian tundra. From there, it's an hour-long trip down the Yenisei River, by barge in summer, and on cars over ice in the winter. Urgently getting to Moscow wasn't that hard. There, however, we faced additional difficulties. First of all, apparently I couldn't actually fly to Norilsk with Lana as the city was closed to foreigners. Before we could even process that, we were told that the airport was closed for all air traffic due to poor weather conditions, and that the weather wasn't expected to improve at all that week. I tried to console Lana as best as I could, but the news of her mom getting worse drove her mad. Soon, Lana suggested an alternative. It was possible to fly to a city a fair bit south of Norilsk, which was safer from the storms. For a modest fee, a family friend living there was willing to take a day's journey up the ice road to Lana's hometown. Well, more like a night's journey, since according to him, it was better to travel at night by car's light than by what passed as daylight there. I told my wife she was insane. She, however, was adamant on her plan, saying she's done Zimnik, how Russians call their ice roads, many times with her dad, and it was perfectly safe. She wouldn't budge no matter how I pleaded and told me I was welcome to stay in Moscow. Obviously, that wasn't an option, and in the end, I gave up. We flew to our next destination, and the cold hit me as soon as I stepped out of the plane. It was a different kind of cold, invasive and ruthless. It didn't care about the layers of sweaters and socks I had on. I shivered, imagining how much colder it was going to get. We met with the trucker who was to take us up north. He called himself Kolya and addressed my wife as Sveta, the Russian version of her name. Me, he didn't address me at all, instead referring to me derisively as Mr. Amerikashka whenever he spoke to my wife. Lana told me with a chuckle she didn't tell Kolya I could understand Russian, although I don't think he would have cared. Kolya was supposed to be a few years younger than my wife, but appeared much older, his skin and posture worn down by the harsh conditions of his homeland. He laughed at our American shoes and coats and said he would pack extra jackets and socks for us just in case. His brother helped load his truck, which looked like it had seen the fall of the Soviet Union, and then Kolya sat down to enjoy a shot of vodka, one for the road. My wife saw me blanch at that. "This isn't New York, or even Moscow," she said quietly. "People here are a bit behind in terms of DUI. Don't worry, he won't drink enough to get impaired. He's seen that kill people on the road." Indeed, the first shot was his last, and Kolya hopped into the truck. He offered my wife the shotgun seat, which, as far as I understood Russian macho culture, was basically equivalent of throwing a glove in my face. Whatever, as long as he got us there. The road was a dark stretch of ice and packed snow, powdered by the fresh snow that had fallen that morning. Snowdrifts bordered both sides of the road and leaked onto its surface a fair bit. Otherwise, it was the same barren flat surface for miles. In the first couple of hours, we saw a few cars going the opposite way to us. Then, a car going in the same direction as us overtook us and disappeared in the darkness ahead at surprising speeds. It was a tiny, rusted-through Subaru. At that moment, I gave up on understanding Russians then and there. Shortly after the Subaru disappeared, it started snowing. Just a bit at first, then more and more. Kolya didn't seem bothered, and I tried to stay calm as well, which I managed mostly successfully until the wind joined in. Unlike the snow, the wind started hard from the get-go. Have you ever heard the wind howling and become unsettled by the sound? Now, imagine the same, but in the depths of a black night lit only by your car's headlights. Except for your own vehicle, the world around is silent and devoid of life, frozen until spring. Not that you can see much through the thick snow that is now the wind's plaything, flurrying around the car, blanketing the windows. Our pace slowed to a crawl as Kolya swore colorfully in Russian. "Maybe we should stop and wait it out," I suggested nervously. "We can't," Lana said without bothering to ask our driver. "If we stop, there's a good chance the car won't start again, and we are stuck here waiting for someone to pick us up. And the road's been empty today." The realization we were at a very real risk of freezing to death hit me like a ton of bricks. I leaned back into my seat and closed my eyes, wordlessly praying for the best. The only response was the wind howling. It sounded so strange. It would start low and quiet, and then grow louder and louder until it was a yowling crescendo, and then cut off abruptly, then start again. And the sound came from different directions.
each starting at a different time, like a pack of wolves howling at each other. I opened my eyes to obvious tension in the car. Lana and Kolya were both hunched forward, peering intently through the glass for all the good it did them. Kolya glanced back at me. "Don't worry, be happy," Kolya proclaimed with a horrible Russian accent. "It's all okay. Don't worry, America." He was lying, of course. I might have been useless on the ice road, but I was a criminal defense lawyer, and a good one at that. And Kolya was a bad liar. There was sweat beading on his face and neck, and his voice was forced. He was very much afraid, and that made me afraid too. Kolya murmured something to my wife, too quick and quiet for my distracted mind to decipher. She simply nodded. What did he say? "There's maybe a village half an hour up the road. If we keep at this pace, we get there and settle down until morning," Lana said. "I see. Sorry about the delay." In reality, I was extremely happy to hear that. Bad wind, huh? Lana grabbed my hand, quick and sudden as a snake. "Don't mention the wind." Another sound came through the storm. A long, tinny wail that sent shivers down my spine. It took me a few moments to recognize the familiar sound of wind whistling through walls and chimneys, and then another moment to realize there were no walls around for the wind to whistle through. I opened my mouth to comment, and my wife's grip tightened on my arm. In that moment, I knew to keep quiet. We drove in tension-filled silence as a cacophony of sounds erupted through the storm. Wails and shrieks, howls and cries. No way the wind was producing all of that. The sounds grew closer, grew louder. I grabbed my wife's hand as we both stared desperately ahead. Through the flurry, we barely made something out. A large, dark shape reflecting our lights, or maybe piercing the darkness with lights of its own. Kolya cursed and swerved to the side. We were passing by another car stuck in the snow, its blinkers flashing. "Stop," Lana said, sudden and harsh. "What?" Kolya asked in Russian. "You're crazy." "Stop," my wife repeated. "On the ice road, you help. That's the rule, remember?" Kolya gave her a long, hard look that I didn't like at all. "That's the rule," he echoed, and hit the brakes, slowing the car without actually stopping. I opened the door and peered outside. The driver of the stuck vehicle was already running towards us. I recognized the car itself as the Subaru that passed us earlier. "Thank God you people were," the driver began. "Get in, idiot," Kolya shouted, and the guy shut up and jumped in quickly. He was just a kid, no older than 20, with dark red hair and a patchy little beard. He looked cold and terrified. "Thank God," he repeated in a hushed whisper. "I was sure they'd get me." "They?" I asked, confused. Kolya and Lana turned to look at the kid in unison, and their stares could kill. Yeah, I mean the wind and the snow." The kid corrected himself quickly. I had a sudden abrupt feeling that it was too late for that, even as I still had no clue as to what was going on. We drove on, and the interplay of howls and shrieks outside the car became unbearable in the silence. "What's your name?" I asked him the best I could. He blinked at me. "Sergey. My parents are away. It doesn't matter. I shouldn't have been driving, but I wanted to make it to my girlfriend's birthday." "Quiet," my wife barked, and we did. Immediately, I noticed a change in the surrounding sounds. They were much louder now. The highest-pitched shrieks rang in my ears. The low, insistent howling seemed to surround the car. And every now and then, something that sounded like an actual roar cut through the night. The car picked up the pace. I looked at Kolya and realized he was absolutely flooring the gas pedal. Poor visibility be damned. His truck was lurching along as fast as it could manage in the conditions. And yet, The encroaching racket made it obvious we were nowhere near fast enough. Then, the car hit something. We were all jerked forward as the truck came to a staggering halt. I hit my temple hard on the back of my wife's seat. "What was that?" I groaned. "Must have hit a chunk of ice or something." Lana's voice sounded strangely muffled. I remember focusing on her lips, and how pale and thin they looked. The dull, resounding pain in my head exploded into something hot and overwhelming, and I collapsed into the back seat. "He's passed out," Sergey called out. I wanted to correct him, but my voice wouldn't obey me. My lids seemed to weigh a ton each. I could barely open my eyes enough to see the trio of Russians huddled together. The car's flickering light illuminated their pale faces. "What now?" Sergey asked nervously. "Well, let's see." I don't think I would have been able to understand complex Russian in that state, if it wasn't my Lana speaking, her voice so familiar down to every inflection. "Why don't you go out and check what we hit and see if we can clear it somehow?" "What?" "We helped you, didn't we?" In the car's light, Lana's green eyes seemed very blue. "So why don't you return the favor? After all, on the ice road you help each other. That's the rule." Kolya grumbled in agreement. Then he reached over and pulled out a rifle and aimed it at the boy. Sergey whimpered. "You know they're out there." "Well?" Lana's voice was impeccably calm and cold. "I guess you better not speak about them out loud. Better not even think about them, really." My eyes closed against my will. I heard a door swing open and a rush of cold air. Finally, I passed out for real. And in my unconsciousness, I dreamed of horrified screaming and a single terrible roar that filled the night. I came to during the day, on a couch of some local family that agreed to house us for a bit of cash. My wife fussed over me. Once she was sure I was conscious and lucid, she rushed me into the car, saying we could do the rest of the drive by day, and an actual doctor could look at me in her hometown. I settled in the backseat of the car. Vague memories haunted me. "Where's the kid?" "What kid, darling?" Lana asked in sincere surprise. "There was no kid. We traveled alone," Kolya added in Russian, and I wondered how he knew what I was asking about, or that I'd understand his answer. But aloud I could only say, "The young red-headed kid." "Sweetie, I'm getting really worried. You must have hit your head harder than I thought. We gotta get you checked out as soon as we get back to the States. Maybe even a checkup in Moscow." I didn't really know what to say after that. We made it the rest of the way uneventfully. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law had slipped into unconsciousness before we even set out for the drive, and she passed away several hours after our arrival. Lana didn't even get to say a proper goodbye. She is obviously devastated right now, so I'm trying my best to focus on comforting her. We're staying here until the funeral, and I can't say I'm looking forward to the ride back. My father-in-law graciously gifted me a proper Russian winter coat, so I went ahead and packed my American camel coat that proved terribly insufficient for the weather. As I was folding it, I noticed a few curly red hairs stuck to the light beige fabric, and at that moment, I felt so cold. My wife and I recently purchased a cabin up in the mountains. She went up there last Friday to clean. I stayed home to get some work done over the weekend. I didn't think much of it at first, but for some reason I wasn't able to call or text her. I did, however, randomly start receiving voicemails from her. I just assumed her cell service was spotty.
"Hey, it's me. It's so beautiful up here. I cannot wait until you see it. The cabin is pretty dirty, so I better get to work. Love you. I hope everything is okay. Why aren't you answering my calls? It's been storming non-stop here. Oh, by the way, I think the roof is leaking. There was a puddle on the kitchen floor. But it's weird. There's no water on the second floor above it. I'm not sure how that happened. Oh well, that's your job. I miss you. I'll talk to you later. Answer my calls next time.
I found this message strange. I checked the weather forecast for the area, and I did not see any rain. 0% chance all weekend. I tried to call a couple more times. Although her phone rang all the way through, it eventually went to voicemail. No calls or texts back. So I left a message. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to my phone chiming. It was another voicemail from my wife.
Seriously, why are you not calling me back? I'm starting to get worried. My phone says it has a good signal. I tried to drive into town today, but the bridge is flooded. I don't think these storms are ever gonna stop. Also, I'm starting to get scared. I think it's just because I'm by myself, but a flash of lightning illuminated the outside, and I swear it looked like a woman was staring at me through the window. I know there's no one else out here, but it freaked me out. I think my eyes are playing tricks on me. I just wish you were here. Please, call me back.
I played the message again. Then I tried her phone. No answer. I was starting to panic. I loaded my car and headed towards the cabin. It was about a 4-hour drive. I would be able to make it there right at sunset. On my way, my phone chimed again. Another message.
Please tell me you're coming up. Why aren't you answering? I'm officially freaking out. The bridge is still flooded and I can't get out of here. I tried the sheriff's department, but no one answered. Their phone just kept ringing and ringing. Remember how I thought I saw a woman at the window last night? Well, I went outside this morning, and there were bare footprints leading up to the window. I followed them into the woods. They led to this huge hole right in the middle of the ground. I'm really scared. I'm going back to the cabin and I'm locking myself inside.
My heart and mind were racing. I was getting closer, and the sun was starting to go down. I accelerated my car and tore through the back roads. Dark rain clouds formed overhead. I looked at my clock. I still wasn't making as good a time as I had hoped. I was still an hour out, and the sun had already set. Large raindrops splashed against my windshield. My phone chimed again. I could hear a storm in the background. My wife spoke in a frantic, frightened voice. My stomach turned.
She's here. She's in the hallway. The woman from the window. She's just standing there, soaked in mud and water. How did she get in? I'm in the bedroom. I can see her through the gap in the door. Oh my god, what do I do? She's getting closer. The whole cabin smells like death and mud. Please help me, please.
The message ended there. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I arrived at the bridge. Although the rain had stopped, the water was still too high. I pulled over and waded through it. The bridge was just a quarter mile from my cabin. I sprinted the entire way. I burst through the front door and yelled my wife's name. The floor of the cabin was covered in sporadic splotches of black water. The putrid smell of rotten flesh made me gag. I tried the lights. They weren't working. I clicked on my flashlight and searched everywhere, screaming my wife's name. Nothing. As I circled back to the front door, I noticed footprints leading out of the cabin. I followed them into the dense woods. The tracks were fresh in the soft mud. I continued shouting my wife's name as I frantically searched. The footprints eventually led to 2 large, rectangular holes in the ground. They were eerily similar to newly dug graves. They were empty. I'm back at the cabin now. I've been trying to call the sheriff's department, but it just keeps ringing. I've decided to wait here until morning. I just hope she comes back soon. The rain is really starting to pour out there.
I'm an avid reader of scary stories, as I assume most of you listening to this are too. I read them every night before bed, as well as on my breaks at work, as well as any other time of the day. Typically, I don't waste my time with anything less than 500 upvotes. I know, I'm one of those people, but I've always preferred to let others waste their times testing out uncharted grounds. So when a story appeared in the coveted #1 spot one morning, a story that somehow had no upvotes at all, I passed over it. What only helped fuel my disdain for the story was the fact that the title of the story was Read Me. Help Us. Guys, come on. It literally had Read Me in the title. Pathetic. That night, the story was still in the #1 spot. All the stories had shifted around it, but this story was still on top, still with no upvotes. At that point, I literally dismissed it. It was a glitch, some impossibility I could not understand that I did not care. Spot #2 was my new spot #1, and that was fine with me. My suspicion of system malfunction was only confirmed when the story was still on top the next day. And the next. And the next week. And the next month. I got used to tuning it out of my radar and automatically skipping one story down. I did this for about 3 months until finally I realized, hey, why don't I just read this story? Yeah, it was annoying having this junk at the top of my computer that never had any votes, but why couldn't I just give it a chance, you know? When I opened the story, the first thing I noticed was how it was formatted, with a name, then a paragraph, then a name, and then another paragraph. Because I had told my brother about this annoying story when I opened it, I took a picture of my screen and sent it to him. That's the only reason I have some of the original words to it. The first part was titled Nick. This was his story. Nick was lonely. Nick's girlfriend had just broken up with him. Nick needed something to do on Saturday night. Nick got on the computer. Nick read some creepy stories. Nick liked the stories. Nick liked to read so much. Nick continued. Nick read until his stomach shrunk. Nick read until his feet stopped working. Nick read until his eyeballs shriveled up. Nick read until we took him. That was the first story. What was this junk? I decided to keep reading, but the second one was basically the same. Gretel. Gretel was ugly. Gretel wanted to be pretty. Gretel tried to be pretty by putting on makeup. Gretel was still ugly. Gretel cried for an entire day. Gretel felt sick. Gretel stayed home from school. Gretel decided to read a creepy story. Gretel liked the stories. Gretel found her favorite story. Gretel did not stop reading until it was time to eat. Gretel did not stop reading until it was time to go to bed. Gretel read until we opened her mouth. Gretel lost something important. Gretel tasted pretty. First off, these stories weren't really stories at all. They were ridiculous, terribly written, and made no sense. There were dozens of them, stories upon stories, and each was as terrible as the last, ending the same way with them being eaten by whoever we was. As they progressed, the endings of the story became slightly more descriptive, with something coming out of their mouths, but each story was still awful. So why couldn't I stop reading? I realized after about 20 of the stories what time it was, almost half an hour after I had begun. After 100 mini stories, I started to get worried for myself. I had already missed the time I was supposed to leave for work, but I couldn't seem to get up. After about 200 stories, I stopped worrying. All I could focus on was the words, the story, how good it was, how much I loved it, how much I would give to just keep reading,
Everything. Something was wrong. Deep inside, I knew it, but wouldn't let that feeling out. I just couldn't comprehend it while I was reading, being taken over. The last thing I remember is getting to a name on a page. Not the final name with the final story, but a name that mattered. My name. How exactly the story went, I'm still not sure, but I think it was something like this. Tim was bored. Tim read scary stories. Tim read a story he tried not to. Tim liked the story very, very much. Tim could not stop reading. Tim had a tasty soul we wanted. Tim read and read and read. Tim opened his mouth. My phone buzzed. Just like that, the trance was over. I looked down at my phone and realized my mouth was open. Immediately, I slammed my computer shut. And when I tentatively opened it later, the story was gone. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think I can figure it out. Scary stories are great. I probably won't stop reading them, but I think there is something on here. Something alive and wrong. Something that you need to watch out for. Other people, my brother included, have told me similar stories, all where their mouths end up open, and they only stop reading when somebody walks into the room. So please, if you come across a story on here and you just can't stop reading it, smash your computer if you have to, but stop at all costs. And whatever you do not open your mouth, or you very well might end up like one of those names, with a story of your own.
There's an unspoken rule up in the mountains that no matter who you are, friend, bitter rival, stranger, anyone, if you're ever in a bind and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Maybe it's unspoken because it's common courtesy and that whole do unto others thing. Or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone to speak to. In the winter months especially, you'd be hard-pressed to see another soul for weeks, sometimes even months. But that's the rule. You need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. Now, I'm not a burly, seasoned mountain man that flosses with tree bark and never shaves, but I do like to hunt from time to time. I often leave my small Alaskan village for weeks at a time and take to my hunting lodge up in the mountains. I'm a fairly cautious guy, and I know the mountains can be treacherous, so when I leave prepared. I check the long-term forecast, gather the necessary supplies, bring backups of those supplies, and make sure I got enough of everything I need to survive at least a week longer than I plan on staying, just in case. I always believed my precautions would protect me, but like a child's security blanket, they were only a paper-thin illusion of safety. There's no planning when Mother Nature decides she's in a mood. That's why I never expected to get caught in a blizzard that day. It had started out sunny and cold, but as the day progressed, a few clouds formed overhead. By the time they had amassed into a heavy cloud covering, I was already on my way back to my cabin, with a couple of hairs hanging over my shoulder. I named them dinner and breakfast. I was planning on eating breakfast for dinner and dinner for breakfast, if only to make myself laugh. It's the little things that keeps the solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had knocked an awning shut, and all the snow collected on top had fallen all at once. Except it wasn't a single tidal wave of snow. It was a relentless, unending barrage. Last I checked, The weather reports hadn't mentioned a blizzard, and yet a blizzard is what I found myself walking through. It got very dark very fast, and I kicked myself for leaving my flashlight back at my lodge. I had planned on coming home long before nightfall, so I hadn't thought I would need it. I guess I'd been sorely mistaken. Snow prickled painfully as it darted into my eyes. I had to squint almost all the way to keep those sub-zero jerks from stabbing me blind. The wind howled as gales cut through my clothes and right to my bones. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, and couldn't see the 2 feet beneath me as they sank in an ever-growing blanket of white. I'm not sure when I realized I was lost. At some point, I knew I should have arrived at my cabin, but all I saw was white, with a few slivers of gray swaying in the thick breeze. The hairs at the back of my neck became stiff and battered against me with every puff of air, and every awkward, crashing footfall. I was running out of energy, running out of ideas, and I was beginning to panic. I could have spun around in a computer chair 100 times and felt less disoriented than I did in that whiteout. And then, I walked right into a cabin. Literally. It had become so dark and the snow had become so heavy that I couldn't see the structure until I stumbled face first into it. I held my hands against the wooden facade so I wouldn't lose it in the storm, and circled around until I found a door. I wasn't just in a pinch. This was quickly becoming life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I knocked on the door and waited for an answer. Through the howling wind, I could have sworn I heard a "come in." As I swung the door open and stepped inside, a small avalanche of snow tumbled in with me. I didn't bother trying to kick it out as I fought against the wind to close the door behind me. The relief was instantaneous. Without the air whipping at me, I had put a stop to the timer ticking down to my freezing death. "Thanks," I whispered. I turned towards the inside of the cabin and tried to get my bearings, but all I saw was blackness, which meant I had no real way of gauging the size of the cabin. Yeah, I had circled around it, but I had been stumbling around half blind, focused on trying to find a doorknob, so I had no idea what length of the cabin I had covered. I could have walked half of it, I could have circled around it 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the vague outline of someone sitting in the corner. "You're a real lifesaver," I said. He didn't reply. I pawed around for a lighter, a lantern, a matchbook, anything that could emit light, but all my fingertips touched were chains and the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped poking around when I felt an open bear trap. Wouldn't want to get my arm caught in one of those. It was safer to sit still and wait for daybreak. It occurred to me the stranger might have been seeking refuge as well. "So," I started, keeping my tone light and innocent. "You the owner of this cabin?" The answer was more of a hiss than a word. But in that hiss, I heard a faint I sat on the floor, let my hairs down beside me, and reached into my pack. Why I had taken a sleeping bag with me and not a flashlight was beyond me. I removed some of my wet clothes and quickly slipped into my sleeping bag to warm up, making conversation as I did. "Thanks again. That blizzard really came out of nowhere." He replied with the slow, labored, wheezy breaths of an elderly man on his deathbed. "Dangerous." Got that right. I laughed. That's an understatement. "Hungry," he exhaled. "You got a fireplace? I've got a couple of hares. I'll cook them up, it's the least I could do," I offered. His reply was drawn out, like a wolf howling, but without the majestic hum. "No." Okay, as soon as the blizzard dies down, I'll go gather some wood and make us a fire. Can you wait till then? I saw his silhouette shift slightly. There was a rattle of chains. Again, the O stretched out in a long, bloated groan. No. No. Yes. The final no morphed strangely into a yes, like somebody drastically changing to a much higher note on a flute halfway through a breath. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black, pitch white. It was like an afterglow, visible against the black backdrop of the wood, yet still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin, because it was the only hint of light I could see. If you don't mind, I'm gonna try and catch some shut-eye, I said tiredly. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. Mountain folk don't talk much, even when they come down to town for what few supplies they can't make themselves. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I tossed my hairs back a bit farther and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't all that hard for me to drift off despite the wind's song playing outside the walls. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and drifted off. I was awoken by a different sound. A weird snapping crunch that made me shoot up in my sleeping bag, believing the ceiling was about to collapse under the weight of the snow. I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me, but rather next to me, near my belongings. The silhouette was gone from the corner, and I could hear his very deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with rattling chains. My adrenaline was pumping, and I wasn't even sure why. Something about the stranger put me in a state of near panic. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I couldn't afford it. Whatever this guy was up to, I was safer with him than I was out in the blizzard. I grabbed my backpack and propped myself against the wall in a seated position, staring at the silhouette, expecting him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away even as the howling wind slowly diminished in strength. Once or twice, I felt my head begin to dip and my eyes begin to shut, but every time I slipped, the faint rattle of chains snapped me back into consciousness. As the blizzard cleared and the sun slowly rose, light began to trickle into the cabin. The scene filtered through in tiny increments with each layer uncovered by the sun. Like a printer, slowly printing out the full picture one line at a time. I wasn't in a cabin. I was in a large supply shed that was maybe 10, 11 feet long and 7 to 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which makes sense for a supply shed. There were tools, traps, and rifles lining every wall. The silhouette in the corner slowly stopped being a silhouette and started being a distinct person. Skinny. No. Gaunt. Pale. No. Ghost white. Man. No. Corpse. Corpse. I was gutted. He was dead. Not, "Oh shoot, I died overnight, sorry about that," dead. Long dead. Long dead. His body was all shriveled and mummified. Is that even the right word for it? He wasn't wrapped up in bandages or anything like that, but his skin was completely dehydrated and stiff, like an unwrapped mummy. His hair was hanging from his head in unkempt strings. His teeth were poking out of his shrunken lips, with a wide gap where the top right canine should have been. There was a stain of age-old blood soaked into the wood beneath him. I followed it by gaze to its origin. His left foot, and the bear trap in which it had gotten caught. There was an empty hook on the wall above him, with a chain leading to the bear trap. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough for him to reach the front door, or the saw hanging above it. My best guess was the trap had fallen on its own while he was out, and at some point, he had done a supply run in the dark, and had gotten caught in his own trap. He probably died of thirst or something. Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing. He wasn't moving. He was dead as a doornail, and had been for quite some time. I sat there, reasoning I'd been delirious the night before. The fatigue, the dehydration, the disorientation caused by the blizzard. It made me imagine his voice. Those slow, hissing sounds I thought were replies were just the wind outside. I had interpreted them wrong because the loneliness had finally gotten to me. The elements had conspired against me to create a living person out of someone who definitely wasn't. It was a good, logical explanation, and I wish I could say it was true. Except, I'm not the one who bit the head off of my breakfast. It's not my canine tooth I found on the floor next to me. My dry, dirty, wood-like fingernails aren't the ones sticking out of the outside of my sleeping bag. I'm not the one who caked the corpse's dry, cracked lips with white fur. I'm not sure how it was possible, but I definitely didn't stick around for dinner. Hello. I am currently stuck in an elevator. It's been roughly 16 hours now since the elevator stopped, and I don't know what to do anymore. Several times, I have contacted the 24/7 service number printed on the inside of this elevator, but they've been no help at all. Neither have my parents nor the police. By posting this, I'm hoping to get some advice or just people to talk to. Maybe even an explanation for what's happening. I live on the 4th floor of my apartment building, and I usually take the elevator to get there. I got home pretty early from my classes today around 1 p.m., entered the elevator, and, as usual, pressed the button to the 4th floor. Everything was normal, except that between the 3rd and 4th floor, the elevator stopped. Obviously, I was annoyed and called the number of the elevator company that I mentioned before. It's actually not the first time I got stuck in this elevator. 2 years ago, the same thing happened, and after maybe 40 minutes of waiting, an elevator mechanic freed me. Back then, it was no big deal, so I wasn't really worried about it yesterday. I'm also not afraid of elevators, despite having had a few recurring nightmares involving them, which, thinking about it now, is pretty odd. Over the phone, I told the customer service person my address, and he assured me a mechanic will be there within the next 30 to 60 minutes. Luckily for me, the Wi-Fi signal of my apartment is strong enough to be used from inside the elevator, so I decided to pass the time by browsing the internet. After an hour and a half of waiting, I grew impatient, and to be honest, a little worried. I wondered if they forgot about me or maybe got my address wrong, so I decided to call the same number again. Now, this is where things start to get weird. I was speaking to the same person who answered my call earlier. His name was Davies, and told him that no mechanic had showed up. However, he insisted that he does not remember my call from an hour ago, and that my case was not stored in his system. He apologized for any inconveniences and again, promised that a mechanic will arrive within the hour. Another hour passed. It was about 3:30 p.m. now, and still no one arrived. At this point, I was starting to get furious at the elevator company and called them for a third time. Again, the same person answered, and again, he did not remember me.
My heart began racing. Does he have that many customers that he simply doesn't recognize my name or voice, even after the third time? Is he just pretending he can't remember me, and purposely not sending someone for some reason? I demanded to speak to his boss, but he said that he was currently alone in his office. I demanded that he stayed on the phone with me until a mechanic arrived, but he told me he couldn't do that. So once more I waited, and once more no one came. At this point, I've been stuck for almost 4 hours. It was time to call the police, because the elevator customer service was useless. Immediately, I recognized the voice of the 911 operator. It was the same person I had spoken to during the last 3 phone calls. I thought to myself that this was impossible, that it must just be a man with a similar voice, but nonetheless, I was growing more concerned. I played it cool and explained my situation. He said that he would send someone to my location, but they never came. Every minute, I was getting more worried and nervous about the whole situation. How is it possible that no one is helping me? I tried calling my mom, but she won't answer her phone. I've texted and tried to call my friends, but the texts I sent are marked as unread. Emergency services seem to forget or ignore me. I fell asleep at about 9 p.m. for maybe 3 hours, but I can't sleep anymore. Right now, the clock on my laptop shows 5:21 a.m., and I'm still in this small, dirty elevator. It's not even big enough for me to fully stretch out my legs. The light is cold and dim. The brown, windowless walls feel suffocating. I stopped using my phone because the battery was getting pretty low, and now the same thing is happening to my laptop. There are no noises coming from outside. Just silence. It seems like no one is in the building at all. Did nobody try to use the elevator since I got stuck? I have no idea, but it seems unlikely. I feel helpless, and I don't know what to do. I'm not even sure where I am anymore. Have you ever had that feeling that something was following you? Just that incredible sense of dread, that there's something lurking right behind you. Something that's going to do things you fear the most if it catches you. The hairs stand up on the back of your neck, and the cold shivers run all the way up from the base of your spine, and you can't help but turn around. And when you do, there's nothing there. And then you have that wave of relief wash over you, and you have to laugh at how stupid it was to feel the way you did just a few seconds prior. Everyone has that feeling once in a while. But sometimes, if you pay close attention, you'll notice that it's not a stupid feeling. Sometimes, if you really pay attention, you'll actually see that you really are being followed. And when you do finally notice it, it'll be too late. I was leaving work one night. My schedule had been staggered for the night, and instead of leaving at 11 p.m. like the rest of the people here, I was getting out later at 12:30. My friends each mocked me as they left, telling me not to forget to lock up. I left the building and walked towards my car when that feeling hit me. The parking lot was completely vacant, since everyone else had already left for the night. The whole area was completely silent, aside from the buzzing of the street lamps which hummed overhead. I think it was the lack of sound that caused that sensation of fear more than the lack of people. But whatever it was, I kicked myself for being childish and made my way to my car. As I walked, the feeling became too much, and I found myself spinning on my heels to check behind me. Nothing. I sighed and rubbed my eyes. But in that momentary haze where my blurred vision was clearing up, something on the ground looked distorted, unnatural. The shadows of the few cars remaining in the parking lot appeared to be crawling towards me. After staring in disbelief for a moment, I realized that the buzzing I had heard earlier wasn't coming from the lamps. The shadows that crept along the ground towards me were emitting that noise. I slowly walked towards my car, keeping my disbelieving gaze upon those shadows. Suddenly, one of the shadows reached out. Like a snake, the tendril wrapped around my foot. I felt a wave of pain shoot throughout my body. Instinctively, I jumped back and kicked my foot wildly. In that motion, I freed myself and sprinted the rest of the way to my car. Jumping inside and starting it, I couldn't help but think about all the questions rising in my mind. What were they? What do they want? Are they going to kill me? Just then, I glanced out of my window and saw something strange. In the midst of the shadows crawling across the parking lot, a face in the darkness, haunting, smiling. Immediately, I drove out of the parking lot as fast as I could. I could feel myself starting to panic at that point. Sweat began to bead along my forehead. My foot no longer hurt, but that didn't stop me from remembering the pain. As if my foot were burning and freezing at the same time. A feeling like 1,000 needles puncturing my flesh. I didn't want to feel that again. After pulling onto the main road, I took the time to try and calm myself. I tried desperately to convince myself that it was all just a hallucination, brought on by fatigue from overworking. But that's when I noticed something else. As I was driving through town, I watched as the shadows cast from the buildings around me began to peel off the buildings like paint. They were following me. I knew I was in trouble. I floored the gas pedal as hard as I could. My car shook as I raced down the road. In my rear view, I watched as the shadows trailed farther and farther behind. I knew it wasn't over yet. I still had 20 more miles to make it home. I turned on my high beams in a vain attempt to keep the shadows at bay. The streetlights behind me started going out one after another as I passed by them. As I drove, I passed by the factory, which marked the halfway point between my work and my house. A police officer was waiting nearby. At my current rate, the officer turned on his lights and pulled out behind me. For a brief moment, a sense of safety and security built within me. However, that was quickly stripped away as I watched the lights fade in the distance. Upon seeing that, I pressed my foot harder into the floor. I tore down the highway at frightening speed, but finally made it to my city. I was almost home now, and I thought the lights of the city would be enough to keep the shadows away, or at the very least, slow them down. Once again, I looked behind me and saw that building after building, house after house, were slowly getting absorbed into the darkness. I flew through town, running red lights and disregarding all other traffic as the building lights and street lamps were disappearing one by one. I made it to my road, and I knew that this was going to be the last chance I had. I had a gauntlet to run on a narrow, curvy, hilly road, with a lack of lights since everyone would already be in bed. But, right across from my place, was a lamp that always shined brightly. My panicked reasoning led me to believe that the lamp would save me somehow. All I had to do was make it home. The buzz of the shadows were deafening now. They were on top of me. My headlights flickered as my windows went black. I knew it was over. I had lost. But suddenly, the shadows faded, and I could see that lamp rapidly growing in the distance. I had made it. I pulled into my driveway and parked my car, sitting for a brief moment to catch my breath and wipe the sweat from my face. After a moment, I stumbled into my house, walked straight to my bedroom, and fell face first onto my bed. I closed my eyes as I felt my body begin to relax. I cracked my eyes just before I fell asleep. and I stared at a face, looking at me from the shadows in my closet. The last thing I remember was hearing a buzz and seeing nothing but darkness. So remember, when you get that feeling that you're being followed and the hairs stand up on the back of your neck, don't turn around. You don't want to know what's following you. Because it's not that we want to hurt you or torture you. We just want you. We want to take you. And we won't stop until we find you. I'd always thought that life functioned like a system of complex computer programs. For example, when you touch a stove, you get burnt. If you spend too much time in cold temperature, you get hypothermia. If you apply too much strain to a limb, it'll break. Every consequence is a result from a previous action. A simple conditional statement, if you will. Now, I can't confirm the existence or lack thereof in regards to a creator, a god, if you will. I obviously don't have that authority. But if one were to exist, it would make sense that this is just the way that we're programmed, how the reality that we see in front of us was meant to function, just a system of codes. But just like man-made programs, nothing's perfect. And with such a large and complicated one like life itself, even a god would have made mistakes, right? I can pinpoint the exact moment where it all started happening. At that moment, I wasn't at a great spot in my life. Now, I wasn't depressed or anything, just kind of dissociated with everything around me. My life had stagnated, to say the least. I had a feeling that my best years were behind me, and being a mere 32 years of age, it wasn't a good feeling. I had gotten fired from my last job when I was 29. Luckily, though, I had gotten a new one nearly right after. Now, it wasn't one I liked, but I suppose beggars can't be choosers. However, my office was only around a 10-minute walk from my studio apartment, so that was good. Anyhow, it was a late-night work session. Most everybody else had gone home, but I stayed due to the amount of work I had procrastinated on from the weeks prior. I wanted to get a good chunk of it done. At one point, I got up to pour myself some coffee. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a door located in one of the corners of the room. The thing is, I didn't think that I had ever seen it before, but I also rarely went into the kitchen. I find small talk with particular coworkers to be incredibly excruciating. I just assumed that I didn't pay enough attention to notice it. It was a rather large area after all. Out of sheer curiosity, I decided to see where it led. I was honestly expecting it to be a pantry of some sort. However, I was surprised when I opened it. It was an empty, medium-sized room, with smooth gray walls and a gray floor. I walked around, exploring the place for a while before quickly realizing there was literally nothing in here. It was pretty weird in all honesty. I mean, what the hell was this place and what purpose did it have? As I was about to turn and head out, I noticed what appeared to be small objects in one of the corners of the room. Now, I could have guaranteed that they weren't there before. In fact, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw them. I quickly walked over and examined them, discovering that they appeared to be a few rifle bullets. I just tossed them back down and left the room. I was beginning to feel uneasy. I walked back into the office and prepared to head home. I just assumed that the work had been getting to my head. To make sure, I looked around the office to see if anybody else was still there. The janitor was. So I made the assumption that he was the one that had placed the bullets there. But in retrospect, that made absolutely no sense. The sky was already dark as I started to make my way back home. It was around 8 p.m. when I had left. Feeling somewhat hungry, I decided to stop by a pizza place on the way. Now, I had been to the place numerous times, so I had pretty much memorized the opening and closing times for every single day of the week. That's why I found it so shocking that the place was closed. It was always open until 9 p.m. on weekdays. Whatever, I thought. This wasn't even the strangest thing that had happened to me that day. The place must have just abruptly changed their hours. I looked over at the opening and closing times displayed out on the windows to confirm it. However, this was the part that made less sense to me. 6 out of the 7 days maintained the same schedule. It was only today that had changed so that it was closed 1 hour earlier. Although it was somewhat disconcerting, it wasn't beyond explanation. I just went home and made something to eat instead. These kind of small, unexplainable incidents started happening to me more and more often throughout the next few months. Things would be misplaced from where I had last left them. People I didn't know seemed to recognize me, while people I had known for years seemed to have no clue who I was. And I'd keep finding bullets in the most random of places. One of the strangest incidents was when I finally decided to go see a psychologist. After telling him everything that had been happening, he just stared at me for the longest time before saying, "This isn't where you really are. This is just temporary. But it's better that you don't wake up right now," before leaving me by myself in his office. The thing is, while these events were incredibly disturbing, they were still far and few between. In other words, they were still essentially manageable. That all changed on a Saturday a few weeks later. The previous night, I had been out drinking with a few friends. I guess I went a little too hard because I barely remembered anything when I woke up. The thing that I deemed rather peculiar was that I didn't even feel the signs of a hangover creeping up on me. But just like the pizza place, I didn't bother thinking too much of it. These were small details after all. I turned on my laptop and started going through my emails. About a few minutes into that, I got a text from my buddy, who I had gone out with the previous night. "Dude, I know this is gonna sound crazy, but I actually think Matt might have gotten laid last night. You should have came out with us, man." I must have stared at that text for 10 minutes. You see, there were 2 things wrong with what my friend had just told me. One, I vividly remember going out with him on Friday. Now, I don't remember most of the actual night, but I sure as hell remember getting off work and entering our first bar. Second of all, who the hell was Matt? I didn't know anybody named Matt. This was it. I've gone crazy, I thought to myself. But then I started to calm down. This kind of stuff happened to me sometimes. They were just momentary blips in the matrix. This couldn't have been that big of a deal. With this rationalization in my head, I just continued on with the day. I didn't have anything planned, so I decided to stay in and binge YouTube videos. And that's exactly what I did. I remember starting out normal at first. I watched the channels that I usually did. At one point, I found myself watching a documentary on human trafficking. It was so odd, I couldn't for the life of me remember how I had gotten there. As I listened to the narrator speak, I began looking at the recommended related videos. One of them caught my eye. The thumbnail was that of a man in military gear, sitting on top of a Humvee in a desert. However, it was the title that drew me to it. Where do you think you are right now? Because it's not where you're supposed to be. I remember just sitting there trying to understand what the title was getting at. This was strange, wasn't it? I decided to click on it. Now, the video itself was extremely shaky and incomprehensible. It looked erratic in a sense. I could tell that it was filmed inside a building, but I'm not really sure what kind of place. I could make out what appeared to be rotting wooden walls, but that was about it. However, the audio was the really messed up part. There was screaming, desperate, hoarse, painful shouts. About 3 sets in total, and they wouldn't stop. That's when I noticed the duration of the video. 26,288 hours and 22 minutes. Now, I was pretty sure that wasn't possible because of YouTube's upload duration limitations. I closed the video and then the laptop. That was enough internet for today. I yawned and stretched out my arms. I felt so tired for some reason. And that's when I checked the time. It was 11 p.m. I got out of my chair and opened my blinds. It was indeed dark outside. What the hell? I knew for sure I had opened my laptop up at around 1 p.m. There's no way it had been 10 hours. At that moment, I knew that something must have been very wrong here, but what? What the hell could have been happening to me? I checked my phone. 78 missed calls and texts. I began looking through them. Most of them were from my mother. Some were from my friends. A few texts were even from Brandy, my ex-girlfriend from around 3 years ago. I really miss you is what the message said. Why would she say that now? I tossed my phone and started pacing around my apartment. My head started pounding, but it wasn't a headache. My left arm and ribs were also burning with this intense pain that I had never felt before. I went into the bathroom looking for something that could have helped me. Eventually, I found some morphine. I felt sheer bliss as I injected it into my bloodstream. But then, another troubling thought made its way into my head. Why the hell did I have morphine? I couldn't recall a situation that could have led to me having it in my possession. I walked out of the bathroom and started pacing again. This had to be a nightmare, I tried telling myself. But why was the pain so vivid? I decided that I really needed to get some rest. I started heading towards my bed when I was jolted by the sounds of explosions coming from inside my bedroom. I freaked out and ran the hell out of my apartment. I wandered around the streets for a while, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go, and not even beginning to understand what the hell was actually going on. Eventually, I came across what appeared to be a group of 4 men, huddled together at a crosswalk. They all had their backs turned to me, so I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could also tell that they weren't moving at all. I don't know how to explain it, but the air started to feel hostile around me. It felt like I was heading right into danger. I started backing away, but not before the men turned around to look at me. Ironically enough, they had no faces to look at me with. Just smooth, empty skin where an expression should have been. In an instant, they began charging at me. I started running. As I tried to evade what was surely a horrific fate behind me, I began noticing that my surroundings had drastically changed. I wasn't in the city I had been living in the past 3 years anymore. Instead, I was somewhere both familiar and not at the same time. Like I had been to the place before but didn't quite remember where it was. It got to the point where I just couldn't keep running anymore. I remember collapsing onto the pavement and turning back in horror to see the group of faceless entities still thundering their way towards me. I just sat there, waiting for whatever twisted outcome to finally come and claim me. I didn't want to deal with it anymore. However, as the men got to within about 30 meters away from me, they just stopped. A few seconds passed before one of their throats seemed to get cut open by an invisible force. The others looked around frantically before 2 of them literally seemed to explode. The last one just started sprinting away. In absolute shock at what I had just seen, I pulled myself back up and began walking around again. As I did, my mind seemed to be getting clearer. This new city I was in, I started to recognize it more. But what was I doing there? Eventually, my vision started to fade, but in the conventional sense. It was like the area around me was getting too bright. It got to the point where I could barely see anything. I passed out a few seconds later. I awoke in a run-down cabin. I heard a bunch of commotion as figures swarmed around me, talking loudly to each other. I looked over to see a man in a military uniform kneeling beside me, administering a needle into my arm. We made eye contact. I recognized him. "What's up, man? You're safe now. We finally found you." He smiled at me. It was Matt. I did know a Matt. I started looking around the room to find it filled with other military guys. There were also 2 skinny, broken-looking men also being tended to. In addition to that, there were also 3 body bags on the floor. I was still somewhat disoriented, so I passed out again. I woke back up in a hospital room. A man in a suit was sitting by the foot of my bed, looking at his phone. He smiled at me when he saw I was awake. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" He went on to explain to me that I was actually a Navy SEAL. I had been sent on a mission to capture a notorious human trafficker who had been tracked down to an abandoned town. However, things went south and nearly everybody on my team died, leaving only 3 of us, including me, to be captured and used as leverage towards the US government. We were held hostage there for 3 years, constantly being tortured during that time. It was only a few days ago before they finally found us, also managing to kill the trafficker. After dropping that bomb on me, the man left me alone to contemplate. It all started coming back to me. The mission, the ambush. However, I didn't remember the torture. That was when my memory became foggy and was replaced by the life I thought I had been living just a few days prior. The evidence of my physical deterioration was evident. I was bone thin, had cuts and bruises all over my body, and was missing my left ring finger. But I don't remember experiencing any of it. I told all of this to my nurse, but she probably thought I was insane. Who knows, maybe I am. However, I asked for a laptop so I could type some of this down. My request was granted. The first thing that I did was search up major events that happened during the 3 years that I was out of commission. Everything lined up. The Cubs won in 2016. Trump took office in 2017. Carrie Fisher died. I knew it all. I even searched up Brandy's Facebook profile. She had the same picture that she only updated a few months ago. There was no way the last few years of my life had all been imagined. Now, I can't begin to speculate what happened. If it was a glitch or corruption in the Matrix, I couldn't say. Was it a mistake by God? Possibly. But maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe this God, or whoever it was, knew exactly what it was doing. I don't really know what I was thinking when I bought the plush monkey that could talk and gave it to my 6-year-old other than I wanted the boy to cause a ruckus in my house. He pushed the button on the back so many times that I memorized the 4 factory phrases. Ooh ah ah, gimme a banana, a Wilhelm-esque scream, and a Tarzan yell. I thanked God when the batteries finally died on the damn thing. The most amazing thing was that my son did not come crying to me to replace the batteries, seeming content to just drop it and walk away. When I stooped down to pick up the plush animal to put it back in the toy bucket, the tiny speaker in the hard plastic box warbled.
Do you remember when I used to be your son?
I immediately dropped the monkey on the floor. I poked it with my foot once before picking it back up. I pushed the button on the back. Nothing. Still, I was sure I heard it say those words. I called my son over to me and asked him if he ever heard the monkey say anything weird or unusual. That's when the boy's face lit up with fear and excitement, as if I had uncovered something he had been wanting to tell me for a while. My son took the monkey into the laundry room and turned on the dryer, putting the monkey on top of it, so he can't hear us. He wouldn't say a word until he led me outside. I had never seen him like this before. When we were standing out in the backyard, the boy said, "Sometimes it says very bad things to me. It says it wants to hurt us. I was too scared to talk to you, not when it could hear us. You have to break it. You have to go in there and smash it. I wanted my son to learn patience and logic at a young age, and that meant not destroying an inanimate object because of fear. I explained that we both heard a voice that was someone at the factory playing a prank on us, and we might need it for evidence. But the fear in my kid's eyes and words made it clear that this wasn't a matter for the courts. When we opened the door to the laundry room, the monkey had moved from the top of the dryer to the bottom of the door. My son shrieked, even as I tried to explain that it just fell off the dryer because it was shaking. That's when the monkey eked out a long, drawn-out, moaning cry like nothing we've ever heard before. My son shouted for me to stop it. The lower part of my brain kicked in. I brought my booted foot down on the plastic box inside the monkey, crushing it against the laundry room's concrete floor. Something reddish black. Not blood, not oil, but something pungently organic and toxic leaked out from the seams of the plush monkey. You know, you should have listened to your son. Now you are alone, a voice said behind me. I swear, I turned to see something large and old, like the last orange ember of a once great fire sparking just behind my son's innocent eyes. The boy turned and bolted towards the front door, running faster than I ever could. The thing that hid inside the monkey controlled my son's body like a champion, rocketing him into the darkness where the street lamps couldn't reach, cackling the kind of laugh that only comes from novel joy of having fresh lungs and new legs again. I never did see my son again. But on some nights, when it's quiet, I can still hear that laugh in the darkness. About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out from Tacoma into Mount Rainier, a place my own dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son, David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy of the wilderness that I had. But I'm quite convinced that he will be terrified of forests for the rest of his life. When we arrived that Friday, the weather was crisp and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked, or rather, I walked with David on my shoulders for about 2, maybe 3 hours from the parking lot, into a small, desolate camping ground with a pre-made fire pit. I'm not a very overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around a bit while I set up the tent. Just as I was about done and getting ready to unload our 3-day supply into the tent, I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now, I recognize these sounds immediately, as they are sounds he usually makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and saw him sitting in the grass, about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. Even more strangely, he was doing this thing he does when he's particularly excited about something, in which he slaps both of his legs repeatedly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the woods at the same time, but there was nothing in the tree line that I could make out. When I was finally by his side, I asked him what he had seen, and at this, his response was, "Monkey Man." He was smiling, still slapping his legs, and as much as I tried to match his excitement like a good parent should do, suddenly, the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I once again fixed my eyesight on the tree line and peered in very, very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked David up, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to frighten them. I mention this because the sensible thing might have been to hush him, to tell him to keep quiet for a while. But then, I also knew that realistically, this was just an imaginative manifestation. After a few minutes of scouting around with David up on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I believe, so I made us some lunch, still keeping an occasional eye on the space at which David had been clapping and yapping just a few minutes before. As much as I tried to forget it, I just couldn't. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in aliens, ghosts, or even Bigfoots. But I suppose my parental instinct was simply in too much of a high gear for me to let it go. So as the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit more about what he had seen. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked him if it was a big monkey man. David thought about it for a second. He then laughed and nodded. I then asked him if he seemed like a nice monkey man, and David once again giggled in approval. I wasn't really sure what else to ask. Nightfall struck, and on full bellies I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out to feel for David and panic struck me hard. He wasn't in the tent anymore. With only my underwear on, I stormed out but realized it was too dark to see anything. So I dropped back into the tent and tore my flashlight out of my bag. I was screaming his name all the while. With only the weak beam of a flashlight I didn't think I would ever have to actually rely on, I shone it around in circles, still calling out for David. For some reason, I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime. I shouted his name into the trees. As I trotted inwards into the pitch-black woods, I was too frantic to notice how badly my feet were getting scraped up by the bark and stone. After only about a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight and bolt forward. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, utterly still. I grabbed onto him hard, beginning to sob. Still clutching him tightly, I picked up the flashlight again, which had been idly beaming the ground, and looked around for a moment, fending off the darkness. I could see nothing around us. As I carried him back, looking over my shoulder, I asked what had happened. He replied that he didn't know, and that he was tired. David has sleepwalked before, so I was just chalking it up to that. That night, I locked up the tent from the inside with a padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest. David himself slept like a rock, despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I cooked us some breakfast. David had no recollection of what had happened, and seemed content to continue the trip. I thought it would be careless to shrug off last night's event as mere sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business. But I also thought it would be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over it. Thus, I made a promise to myself that if anything else were to happen, we would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice, and helped me take my mind off of things. David was at first a little upset at not having the iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them and sent them downstream, watched some squirrels, listened to the birds. It was everything I had hoped the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day in the tent. I had brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with an electrode, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound, kind of like Operation. I don't remember what it was called, but David found it hilarious. It's a simple game, but supposedly helps develop motor skills. During one of David's turns, he made an error and the little speaker made the sound again, and David bellowed into laughter. What happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything will ever match it. From about 50 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David had made, only it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking, then digitally pitch it down.
I froze, and this time I couldn't hide my fear from David. I could tell by his face he had heard it too. I lifted my finger up to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I also noticed that the sun had completely set. I also realized just how quiet the woods were. Every second felt like an eternal minute as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, enveloped in a thick silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears finally ceased, I leaned over slowly towards my backpack to retrieve my handgun out of it. I never go into the woods without it. When I turned around to face David, I noticed that he had picked up the game again. I sternly removed it from his hand and whispered with equal sternness, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a low, broken voice whispered from literally inches from the tent,
"Not now, David."
The next thing I was aware of is that I was shooting through the fabric in the tent, in the direction of the sound. David was screaming, and as the gunshot rang throughout the woods, I heard the last remnants of something sprinting away. With my hand trembling violently, I opened the padlock and jumped out with a flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into black nothingness. I grabbed David, stuffed everything within arm's reach into the backpack, and ran. The way back was pure terror. There was not a second at which I did not feel as if something was right behind us, ready to leap out from behind us, or the side of the trail, out from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David was, "It's okay, you'll get the iPad soon. Do you want the iPad?" Nothing ever did leap out at us. Nor did I hear anything except the rushing of the wind and the occasional running stream by the trailside. I was so out of it that even in the car, I kept checking the back seat to see if there was something sitting behind us, ready to kill us. I don't know how to explain to David's pediatrician what happened in Mount Rainier. I haven't even told his mother the full story, only that I thought someone came up to our tent and that I had to fire a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He has been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears by the gunshot. I don't really know how to end this story, but one thing is for certain. Never, ever take your kids out to Mount Rainier National Park. I have often heard people say that the day they got a cancer diagnosis was the worst day of their life. That wasn't the case for me. It wasn't that I was happy about it or anything. Rather, I was so shell-shocked and phased out that it really didn't get through to me. I went on for about a week like this, so overloaded by the new information that I basically short-circuited and was running on autopilot. I remember the day that the full truth really dawned on me, though. It happened unexpectedly and all at once. I was out walking my dog, still running on autopilot, when a brick wall of emotions collided with my brain. I was physically and emotionally thrown to the ground. I sat there for about an hour, getting a mixture of judgmental and sympathetic looks as I released all of the built-up emotions from the last week. Once I had let it all out, I stood up and continued with walking my dog. Most people in my situation would probably go through all the motions that normally occur with a serious diagnosis. Call their loved ones, make a bucket list, spend time with their family. Not me, though. I just did what I've always done. Shoved those feelings right back where they came from and continued to live my life as if nothing was wrong. As if I didn't have only 3 months left to live. You see, I was diagnosed with a very rare and very aggressive cancer. I had known for about 2 years that something was wrong with me. I was having all kinds of strange physical symptoms I had never experienced before. I was in and out of the doctor's offices constantly. Doctors, of course, did not seem to take my concerns seriously. By the time they did listen to me, it was already too late. They told me I had 3 months left to live, maybe a little longer if I went on chemo.
I had seen my uncle go through chemo. I was not going to put myself through that just to live a few more agonizing months. So I declined. As I said before, I did not process this information as a normal person would. I didn't make plans to see my family or go skydiving. Instead, I chose to get lost in my favorite vice, social media. Before the diagnosis, I was constantly on my phone, completely absorbed by apps like Facebook and Instagram. I would scroll endlessly, desperately looking for something that I knew wasn't there. After the diagnosis, though, I found that social media was the only thing that gave me some kind of comfort. I would completely immerse myself in it, hours passing without me realizing, somehow oblivious to the time while I stared at the clock in my hand all day. The thing about apps like Facebook is that there is literally no end. So I would scroll day in and day out, fiendishly looking for that momentary dopamine fix that would temporarily numb the pain and take me away from my hellish situation. One day, as I was mindlessly scrolling, an ad caught my eye. Now, I have heard of Facebook ads that creepily seem to correlate exactly with something going on in your life, or something you had mentioned to a friend. I've had that happen myself on a few occasions, but this was a whole new level. The page that posted the ad was simply titled, Life. The ad read, Life, your trial is about to expire. Underneath was a counter with bold red numbers. The counter read, 2 months, 2 weeks, 5 days, 3 hours, 40 minutes, and 14 seconds. It took me a minute to process the significance of those numbers, but when I did, time seemed to stop. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I could feel my hands getting clammy. It had been 12 days since my diagnosis. After staring dumbfounded at the screen for a few moments, my terror began to subside, and the rational part of my brain seemed to take over. Obviously, this is some kind of strange coincidence, I told myself. Even if it wasn't, what are the chances that the doctor had predicted my death down to the exact day? Even so, I decided to investigate the ad a little further. I clicked the link to go to the Life Facebook page. It just led me to a 404 error page. I pressed the back button and observed the ad a little closer. I realized in the bottom right-hand corner, where the sign-up link would usually be on a normal ad, was a link with Save Yourself, written in red script. I hesitantly clicked the link. It redirected me to a new page. The first thing that I noticed was that this page had no URL. The second thing that stood out was the terrible design of the website itself. It looked like a teenager made it in the early 2000s. The word life was once again emblazoned at the top of the page in bold red letters. Beneath was the counter, displaying almost the same exact time, but the minute and second counters had ticked down. The only difference I noticed was that under the counter were 2 box links. One had a blue background with white font that said Renew. The other sported a red background with black font that read Cancel. I stared for a moment, trying to understand what was happening and pondering what my next move was. I shakily hovered my thumb above the Renew button, and before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked. I was taken to a new screen with a sky blue background and white text that read, Thank you for renewing your Life subscription. Your monthly fee will automatically be deducted. Below that was an Accept button. I almost clicked it, but then I realized above it was a checkbox that read Auto Renewal. Most illogical people in this situation would have just exited out of the website, but I have always been a curious person. I checked Auto Renewal and hit Accept. The tab immediately shut down, and when I went to look for the ad again, it was nowhere to be found. Disappointed, I went back to my regular scrolling. A few days later, I had one of my weekly doctor visits. I always thought these were kind of asinine. How many times do I need to go to a doctor to tell me that I'm dying? This visit, however, turned out to be quite different than I expected. Some called it a miracle, others an act of God. When I found out, I cried even more than I did for my diagnosis. The cancer was gone. Not regressed, not smaller, completely gone. No one could explain it. I felt like a new man with a new lease on life as I left the cancer center that day for the last time. I was on top of the world, untouchable. That is, until about a month later. Ironically, I got a phone call as I was walking my dog. The other driver was drunk. It was a head-on collision. My mother was gone before the debris even settled. My whole world was rocked and turned on its head. I live hundreds of miles from my mother, but I was closer to her than anyone else in my life. A few days before her funeral, I was sitting around going through my phone when I decided to check my email. I had a message from a name I didn't recognize called Life is Great. I opened it and recognized the simple design and layout instantly. It said, "Your fee has been processed, and your subscription has been automatically renewed." Underneath was a single red button that read Cancel. I realized the day I received the email was the same day as my mother's accident. My mother's funeral was beautiful. She was a very well-loved woman in her area, so it was very crowded. As the weeks passed, I slowly started to readjust to life without my mother in it. I decided to stay at my brother's house for a little while so we could comfort each other and help each other cope. One day, as I was showering, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I quickly grabbed a towel and ran downstairs. I hesitantly craned my head around the corner to peer into the kitchen. What laid before me was too gruesome for my mind to process. Have you ever seen what a .44 Magnum can do to a person? What was left of my brother sat at the kitchen table. The only reason I was still able to recognize him was the tattoo on his hand that held the revolver. I emptied the contents of my stomach onto the living room floor. As I stood back up and began to catch my breath, my phone chimed. I instinctively went over and picked it up. I received another email from Life is Great. Your fee has been processed, and your subscription has been automatically renewed. My heart leapt into my throat. There was no denying what was happening anymore. I tapped the red cancel button. A new message popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel life? You have 1 month, 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds remaining if you cancel. Do you wish to continue? I woke up feeling a presence standing beside my bed, jolting me out of my sleep. It was my son, and it was 2:38 in the morning.
Dad, there's something in my closet. I'm scared.
My wife rolled over at the sound of his voice.
Huh? What's wrong, honey?
She said, half asleep. Closet monster, apparently, I said.
Oh, that's new.
My wife replied.
Come here, honey. Your dad'll check it out. Come sit on the bed next to Mommy.
I got up from the bed slowly and stretched. My son slid under the covers next to my wife, and I saw her drifting back to sleep. I said to her, "Sure you don't want to come along? It might take 2 of us to take this thing down,"
Nah, you got this, babe. I believe in you.
she said with a sly smile.
And if you don't make it back, well, you were a pretty good husband.
I laughed to myself and headed out of the room. My son's room was upstairs on the opposite side of the house, so up the stairs I went and made my way closer to his bedroom door. The door to his room was wide open, but the closet doors, which you could see from the hallway, were shut. About 5 feet out in the hallway, I actually started to hear something from the closet. An intermittent hum. I slowed my pace a little at hearing it. My first thought was it was perhaps a tablet or another device under a pile of clothes playing some loud noise over and over again. Whether it was or not, I got a lot more cautious and picked up the bat that was laying beside my son's dresser. With bat in hand and another deep breath to calm down, I grabbed the knob and turned it. As the door opened, I saw that I was at least correct about the noise coming from underneath the clothes. A huge pile was stacked in the back corner, and the noise, much louder with the door open, emanated from it. The clothes were shifting slightly as the noise rang out. With the door open, I could tell it was a human voice. A child. I gripped the bat with white-knuckle force, and I began pulling clothes away from the pile, despite the fear and sweat bursting out of me. Then I saw it. I saw the source, but it was impossible. It was my son, tied up with a gag in his mouth. Tears streamed down his face. His face was beet red. I removed the gag from his mouth. He took a deep breath, then screamed. It wants Mom.
I enjoy listening to police scanners on my day off. After reading through quite a few stories on the internet, I can tell I'm not the only one. Like many of you, I have also heard my fair share of weird and unsettling information over the scanners. But only one ever really unsettled me to the point that I considered turning off the scanner for good. I was sitting in my recliner with the news on mute, and the scanner turned up as I sipped a glass of sangria and relaxed after dinner. Generally, I just kind of zone out, only tuning back in fully when I hear something interesting going on. It was late in the evening, and when I heard a code 187 calmly but quickly relayed through the scanner, I instantly came out of my trance. For those of you who don't know, code 187 is the code for murder or homicide. I listened intently as the officers quickly mobilized and prepared to head to the address given by the dispatcher. Nothing unusual happened for a bit. At this point, it was simply the situation that was extreme, not the details about it. Murder, while horrible, is nothing new, right? Well, that's where this gets interesting. I listened as they approached the address. When they pull up, an officer points out that the house looks as if it has been abandoned for a long time, but the front door is wide open. The radio goes silent for a bit after this, but in a few moments I hear an officer call out that him and his partner are going in to check out the house. The dispatcher confirms the information, and it goes silent as the officers head in. For a while, nothing happens. There is some chatter as another pair of officers head towards the location, but other than that, nothing. As I sit and wait for more information, a blood-curdling shriek emits from the police scanner, causing me to drop my glass and break it as I cover my ears. After the shriek subsides, I hear panic chatter from the pair of officers who pulled up at the address just moments ago. The house is apparently on fire now, but one of the officers swear they see a figure making its way through the flames. Her partner is trying to calm her down, but the officer ignores her as her shaking voice crackles through the scanner about an impossibly large human shape making its way around the back of the house. I quickly switched stations to confirm that the fire department is being dispatched before switching back to the police feed. There is a lot of yelling and screaming, and I hear the officer that was trying to calm down the other one say that he's going to give chase to the possible suspect that disappeared behind the house, telling his partner to stay in the car and keep an eye on the front in case the suspect tries to circle around. At this point, I'm not even sure if they realize the radio is still on, or if it is getting ignored amongst the chaos and panic. I can soon hear the sirens of fire trucks getting closer before the sound becomes almost deafening. I can't hear much as the sirens are so loud they drown out any other noise. I wait for around 15 minutes before finally turning off the radio and walking to the closet in the kitchen to grab a broom and a dustpan to clean up the broken glass. I sit back down and stare at the television before deciding to check the police scanner one last time, and then head to bed. I turned it on, and all I hear is screaming. Screams of horror and pain that are nearly as loud as the sirens from earlier. I try to listen as closely as possible despite this, a sick sense of curiosity wanting to glean some kind of information from the radio that, at this point, was clearly left on. As I listen, I hear a small voice whisper the words, "Dear God, no," before a wet thud and a roar come through the scanner. I hear the sound of crushing metal before I quickly shut it off and simply stay seated for nearly an hour before going and laying down in my bed, where I spend the whole night trying to sleep and failing miserably at it. I finally drift off at around 10 in the morning and don't wake up until 6 in the evening. I woke up already curious as to if there was any news on what happened last night. I walked into the kitchen and made a cup of coffee before going to sit back in my chair and turning on the local news station. A reporter stands in front of the remains of a burnt house, reciting information from a police report. Let me just sum it up for you. The two officers that went in to investigate the homicide were killed in the fire, but not by the fire. They apparently both had their throats slashed before the fire was set. The weird thing from the report about this, though, was that the wounds were quickly cauterized right after and had nothing to do with the house fire. They also found another body they have yet to identify. Well, I should say they found body parts, as the remains were spread all over the burnt remnants of the house. Another officer was found burned to death behind the house. That wouldn't be so odd if it wasn't for the fact that the body was found nearly half a mile away from the house itself, surrounded by scorch marks that strongly suggested he had been burned right there, and not in the house fire. The officer that stayed in the car was found mangled underneath the police car she had just been sitting in. The car itself was flipped over, and they had to move it just to retrieve the body. Hers was the only one that had no burn marks whatsoever, something that still continues to perplex me. All of that was disturbing and creepy for sure, but honestly, that is far from what scares me. Whatever or whoever was there that night was never found. Police searched for days. On top of that, I was the only one to hear the screams and roars. Nobody else listening to the police scanners that night heard anything but silence, as their radios had all been broken long before I heard the first shriek. That is what truly keeps me from sleeping. The worst part is, there are some days when I smell smoke lingering around my house, and I see small patches of burnt grass appear occasionally in my front yard.